Okay, good evening and welcome everybody to the fourth Satadru Sen Memorial Lecture. As you know, we've had the series opened by Vijay Prashad, then we had Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta, then we had Professor Kama MacLean from Heidelberg University. And now the fourth lecturer in the series is V Geetha, who is a feminist, historian, and an independent publisher associated with Tara Books, which produces magnificent books for children. So without further ado, I just want to get into the lecture. And I mean, most of us present today know Satadru Sen, have heard of Satadru Sen, or have read Satadru Sen's work and indeed engaged with his excellent work on colonialism in South Asia. And Satadru's work actually spans many genres and many themes. Not only has he written centrally on the fault line of colonialism, he's also written on childhood and the invention of childhood, particularly in Bengal. He's written most profoundly on the idea of incarceration, informed very much by his experiences in the United States, teaching in the United States. But what he has done is to look at the islands of the British Empire as centers of incarceration, particularly the Andaman Islands. And his work on the Andaman Islands also deals with the idea of the primitive, where the engagement of both colonial powers as well as the independent India towards the inhabitants of the Andaman Islands has been like flies to wanton boys, as Shakespeare might have put it. But the most fundamental thing about Satadru's work is a kind of strong, rugged, pragmatic streak of unsentimentality when he writes his history. And this is something that I would like to highlight, also because I think Geetha's work addresses this, where she looks at colonial histories and nationalist histories through the central fault lines within India, rather than creating a kind of easy binary between the atrocities of colonialism and the glories of nationalism, so to speak. So in this era that we live in, where there is a call for apologies with regard to empire, calls for restitution, reparation, return, all of it justified. But underlying this is the suspicion for most of us who are skeptical historians that oppressive societies are blithely forgetting their own casual brutality towards their marginal elements and to those who are excluded within society. Satadru came over to South Africa to participate in a conference on Gandhi, delivered an excellent paper filled with irony and distance. And then he went on to visit Namibia after his visit here to Johannesburg. And he spoke to me later, and we had conversations on the Herero massacre. For those of you who do not know about this, between 1904 to 1907, when Namibia was still a German colony, there was an extermination of the native and indigenous inhabitants through battles, through starvation, through thirst in the desert. Over 80,000 people were killed. 80% of the Herero were exterminated. 50% of the Nama were exterminated. And the question really became then of why for Satadru at least, for why the whole issue of memorialization didn't happen in Namibia. And he raised the question at that point, of what does it mean to think with internal colonialism at the same time as an external colonialism? And for those of you who have been following Satadru's writings, it's not only his historical writings. He wrote a brilliant blog called Das Blog, which is still available online for those of you who wish to read it. And January 2018, he has the following entry, and I quote, "The urge to remember what they did to us is a second-rate sentiment, one that is literally sentimental, compared to the imperative of recalling what we have done or are capable of doing to others. There's something salutary about the low-key way in which Namibian nationalism has structured the memory of genocide, using it as a historical bridge to other victims and adversaries of colonialism, rather than a fetish of exceptional victimhood. As a source of justice, memorializing genocide is more necessary for the murderers than the murdered. The rest is therapy. Extremely resonant words for our times. And who better than to address this whole history of oppression, of freedom, of emancipation, of marginalization in a truly unsentimental manner than V Geetha, who has been a historian of caste movements in southern India. And I remember when her book Towards a Non-Brahmin Millennium came out in 1998, I had begun teaching at the University of Hyderabad a year after. And this work was profound in terms of what it managed to summon up within the students and in the classroom as people began to engage with the fact that their lives and their politics mattered. And for those of you familiar with the University of Hyderabad, know that there's a significant proportion of Dalit students from the Telangana area. Geetha has also written extremely critically and perceptively on India's contemporary landscape, patriarchal landscape, the issues of sexual violence, the idea of impunity with regard to sexual violence in India. And as a feminist, she has a whole range of articles which relate to women and the law, or gender and the law more generally. But for me, the most important aspect of Geetha's work has been her association with Tara Books for Children, because my children grew up on those books, beautifully illustrated books, books that do not condescend to children, books which draw in the art of a marginalized community, the Gond artists, for example. There's a brilliant book on Marxist theory of money, which I think will give any theoretician a run for their money, so to speak. And one of the things about Geetha's work is that the dreams and enactments of personal freedom, of equal and democratic practice, and most important for me, of a new knowledge for a new generation, reminding the young of an imagination of self, history, and nature that is a constant and penumbral presence in our lives. And her most recent book, of course, thinks with India's most prominent intellectual, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and his coruscating critique of rule-bound hierarchies and of a landscape of freedom that went beyond a nationalist myopia. So today, Geetha will be speaking to us on the imaginations of Buddhism in South India and what Buddhism meant in terms of an insurgent imagination that always ran parallel to the landscape of hierarchy. So over to you, Geetha.
Thanks very much, Dilip, for that wonderful and very generous introduction. And many thanks to Satadru's mother, Karabe Sen, for having me deliver this memorial lecture. I have been reading Satadru ever since Dilip requested me to give this lecture, and there are so many aspects of his work that speak to me. But today I think I will restrict myself to one important part of his thinking, especially as it unfolded after 2014, when we had the Hindu right being swept to power in India. And we had this great and perturbed concern for the state of history and the historian's vocation in light of all that has transpired since that year. And he calls on us as historians, as concerned citizens, to pluralize our understanding of the past. And he makes a claim for the historian's creative and critical engagement with public history, and asks us to understand and speak to the different ways in which the public imagine their relationship to the present as well as to the past. So that's where I'm going to start from. So let me first start sharing my screen. So this is Satadru, who makes this really very forceful case for rescuing from the mob a critical mass of citizens who would rely on dialogue rather than on lynching, on the understanding that dialogue and discussion and dissent constitute superior forms of public action. So in that spirit, I go on to my topic, which is the recklessness of memory, doing public history in Tamil Nadu. And what you see here is, of course, Ambedkar's image morphed onto the image of the Buddha. And this is something that I took from Neelam Publications, which is an Ambedkarite and Dalit publishing house, which has been started by the Tamil film director Pa Ranjit and his associates. And I thought that this image captures the sense of my title, the manner in which contemporary Dalit thinkers and actors seek to reimagine the history of Tamil Nadu, if not the whole of India, in and through a Buddhist lens. And it seems to me that there's a certain memory that they are drawing upon. And this memory, in my understanding, is open-ended, it's adventurous, and I think it's very reckless in what it sets out to do. Reckless not because it has no regard for the protocols of inquiry, of historical inquiry, but because there is a great and insistent need to remember the past in a certain way. And the imagination then necessarily must be reckless if it wants to engage with that past. And this is something that Ambedkar himself talks about in his writings on the untouchables, when he says that since there is no proper recorded history, one might have to draw upon the imagination to fill the gaps. So this sort of creative tension between an imaginative need for a past that is linked to Buddhism and a present that anchors that past in a demand for equality and justice, I think herein lies the recklessness of memory. So let me come to that by sort of starting with three very, very small stories from the present. The first has to do with this court case in which a judgment was delivered not so long ago. So what you see here is a deity called Kalaivetti Muniyappan, which translates as the beheaded Muniyappan. And if you can see, the head is slightly twisted as it sits on the neck. And it has been argued that Muniyappan was perhaps the Buddha, that this is in all likelihood a Buddhist statue, an argument that was made as early as 1940 and which has since been made by many Dalit Buddhists. And one such Dalit Buddhist went to court over a particular temple of Kalaivetti Muniyappan in 2011 and said that this is actually the Buddha, so the shrine should cease to be a Hindu shrine and should be handed over to a Buddhist trust. And the court hearing went on for several years, and then at one point the Madras High Court said, let's have the Archaeological Survey of India examine this icon and tell us if it could be the Buddha. And the ASI not very long ago said, yes, this indeed is a statue of the Buddha, and that Hindus should stop worshipping at the shrine and it should be handed over to the Archaeological Survey of India. Any case, the court is being heard. The court is still sort of debating on this issue. There's been an appeal and so on. But while we wait that, wait the verdict of this case, what I would like us to take note is that this notion of Muniyappan possibly being the Buddha is something that's been in circulation, as I said, from the 1940s, but more insistently over the last decade or so on account of the claims being made by Dalit scholars and Dalit political thinkers about the religious and other histories of Tamil Nadu. And of course, I'll come to that later. So this is my first story. The second one, this is an image from a recent short film by the filmmaker Pa Ranjit. And this is about everyday conflict in a northern Tamil Nadu village between Dalits and others. And this child is with her father. Her father gets into an altercation with a dominant caste man and violence ensues. And at the end, when everyone's beaten up everybody else, the child and her father say that perhaps it's time to also remember that we need to live here together and there's no point in continuing this violence. And the Buddha, of course, stands testimony to this compassion that the film invokes. And interestingly, the film is called Dhammam. And I think this image captures something that is very interesting, because the icon of the Buddha, and this is probably a 10th century statue, and you find several of these statues across various riverine valleys, particularly in the Kaveri Delta. And they've been since recovered and handed over to museums, but that they are a part of the landscape. And this child treats the Buddha as a playmate, so to speak, something that the Buddha himself perhaps might have relished. But I think this captures what this Dalit director wants us to understand about the Buddha and his presence in our lives. And this also is going to be speaking to a lot of people who've seen such statues across their immediate environments. Now, the third thing is a birthday remembrance of Ramasamy Periyar, the founder of the self-respect movement, atheist, iconoclast. And I've translated the text there, but basically what the text says, I mean, it's pretty clear, but I think there's also this association that some Dalits want to make between Periyar and the Buddha, that the Buddha is not simply someone that we wish to induct into Tamil historical narratives, but also that the Bodhi tree continues to flourish in Erode, Periyar's birthplace, and that this iconoclastic man who was filled with ethical fury was as close to the Buddha as anyone else. So I think these three things for me capture the continuing importance of the Buddha in present day debates and transactions. And a lot of this has to do with, of course, what a new generation of scholars who work on Tamil history, not simply the trained historians, so to speak, but equally the publicists or the ideologue who have sort of tried to link the Tamil past to the Buddha and to Buddhism. And I've been intrigued by this relationship between the antiquarian and the publicist, as I called it in my book on Periyar, because I think both of them together have rendered history a matter of popular interest. So much so that, if you take, for instance, the recent archaeological findings at Kuredi, you'll see that it's attracted widespread public interest. People go in droves to the site. So in the sense of wanting to own up to the past in view of how you see yourself in the present, I think Dalit deliberations with regard to the Buddha and Buddhism become very important. And what I want to do in what follows is to provide a kind of a short and shifting genealogy of what Dalits are claiming in the present. And it's interesting that not all the claimants in the past were Dalits either. So this is something worth thinking about, and that's where I wish to go today. Let me start with the missionaries who first came into Tamil Nadu in the early 17th century. And one of the most interesting missionaries was Bartholomew Ziegenbalg, who worked in the eastern Tamil port city of Chankubar or Tarangambadi. And I thought he would be a good person to start with because he was very interested in the heathen faith, so to speak, and eventually ended up writing two books, Malabar Heathenism and the origin stories of the Malabar gods. And what makes his work interesting is he said that he had put together this information based on his conversations with native informants, native Hindus. Now, subsequently, scholars have wondered what that actually means because they also see it as a kind of a way of justifying one's own narrative, that, this is not something that I pulled out of my head. This has basis in what people think. But let's not get into that argument. But what's interesting is that Ziegenbalg spoke to people who sort of gave him the sense of the Buddha in his relationship to the Hindus. And it's very evident that for a lot of them, the Buddha was an enemy of Hinduism, so to speak, particularly of the Brahmin caste. And as informant after informant recounts in their accounts of the origins of the Hindu gods, Vishnu took this avatar to beguile the Buddhists and to win over them. And the reference here perhaps is to the Tamil Vaishnavite tradition, which is seen as a kind of a counter to Buddhism. And the Vaishnavites themselves, in their songs and in their poems, do enter into polemical fights with the Jains and the Buddhists and the Shaivites and many others. Any case, so here is Ziegenbalg. Then there's this other more famous missionary, or as famous missionary, Codot, a French Jesuit, who anticipated the writings of the Abbé Dubois, who wrote on Hindu manners and customs and so on. And he repeats a similar sense of, a similar understanding of Buddhism in relationship to Brahmanism. And so you wonder if this was something that the missionaries heard, or if it was perhaps a trope because you also have the other missionary, the Jesuit missionary, Roberto de Nobili, who preceded these other two missionaries, who also wrote of the Buddhists in a similar way. It could be that he had picked up this understanding of Buddhism from his fellow Jesuits who wrote on Buddhism in China and Thailand and so on. But what interests me is that the missionaries, in their attempts to understand Hinduism or heathenism, were confronted with this kind of a parallel story about Buddhism and on how Buddhists and the Buddha had tried to undermine the Hindus and undermine faith and belief, and was spreading atheism. And as Ziegenbalg's informant told him, horror of all horrors, they said all castes were equal. So, so this is interesting. And because of the reliance on native informants, it seems to me that this marks a public moment, that this is something that was debated in public, though perhaps not in the way we understand that today. But Ziegenbalg's ideas were formed by conversation with the wider public. And the wider public has remembered the Buddha in this manner. So that's as far as the missionaries go. Then something of the missionaries' interest in Buddhism sort of also remained with them, and of course were put out for circulation in their tracts and in their writings and so on. But more importantly for us, the next interesting moment is what I call the scholar adventurous moment. These are the men of the East India Company who went on to acquire artifacts and manuscripts and made drawings of monuments and tried to piece together an understanding of South Indian history. I say South Indian because the more adventurous of them, Colin Mackenzie, wandered about in the Deccan, particularly in the Mysore kingdom, as well as in the Tamil regions. I'm not going to go into the details of what they did, but just to point out that they argued that the Tamil past was significantly Jain, that there were very important Jain literary productions, chief amongst which was a Tirukkural, and that this is very important as far as the 19th century is concerned, because it tells us that the Tamils had their own very heightened sense of ethics. So for both the missionaries as well as the men from Madras who were interested in the Tamil past, whom Tom Troutman calls the Madras Orientalists, it was important to establish an equivalence between the ethical traditions of Tamil Nadu and Christian piety, so that the whole move to govern India and bring it into the context of progress and modernity could look to this ethical tradition for anchoring its own understanding of progress and Christian mores. So it's a complicated relationship they had with the Jain tradition. But I think what's interesting is they make it very clear that the Tamils not only created works of literature, which today we might call Hindu, but they were very aware of a broader non-Hindu tradition known elsewhere as a Shramana tradition. And the Madras Orientalists chose to read that as mostly Jain, though clearly some of it would have been Buddhist as well. So that's important. And the one missionary who brought it all together, this idea that the Tamil traditions were different, and that this difference did not only have to do with the Shramanas, but equally with the fact in Tamil Nadu, you have a large and preponderant community of non-Brahmins, of those we call Bahujans today, and that their religiosity is noticeably different from whatever else you find in the northern plains. And that this is something that we need to understand, and we find sufficient evidence of this in the Tamil language. And so Caldwell goes on to speak of the difference signified by the word Dravidian, by which he refers to the Dravidian family of languages. And so he brings together a Protestant interest in lingualism, that you need to communicate in the language of the people, that the Tamil language is a foremost amongst the Dravidian languages and does not owe anything to Sanskrit for its genius, that Tamil culture is different from the culture of the northern plains, and Tamil Hindus are not Hindus in exactly the same way. Never mind the Shramanas of Tamil Nadu. Even the Hindus are not the Hindus that you see in the north. And this has to do with what Caldwell thinks is a notion of Dravidian difference. So you have the missionaries entering this debate in some very interesting ways. and thereby showing us that when you think of the Tamil past, there are these claims that Buddhists sort of had their own place, that the Shramana past was equally a part of the Tamil, of Tamil antiquity. And then, of course, there's this question of language through which the ethics of the Shramana past, as well as the difference of Dravidian religiosity, get expressed. So this is what you find sort of these arguments unfolding over the long 19th century. And then these meet other arguments. And, so you have this very, very interesting thing happening in the 1970s, 1870s, where you have these free thinkers and atheists. So around the 1870s, two institutions, both related to each other, were begun in the city of Madras, the Madras Free Thinkers Union and the Madras Secular Society. And these were linked to the London Rationalist Association and the London Secular Society. And they brought out two magazines. On the left, you see Tattva Vivesini, their Tamil magazine. And interestingly, but not surprisingly, Tattva Vivesini serialized a series of essays on that very important anti-Brahmanical treatise, the Vajrasuchi, which was written ostensibly by the Buddhist Ashwagosha. And this is a text that circulated widely in the 19th century. It was translated into many Indian languages, notably Marathi. And Masalamani Mudaliar, who wrote for Tattva Vivesini fairly regularly, did his own version of the text and titled it Varuna Beda Surukam, a paraphrase of Varuna Beda, caste differences, in which he debunks all claims that Brahmins make to birth-based superiority. And the arguments are clearly drawn from the Vajrasuchi. And so this is interesting because here you have a different relationship to antiquity. Masalamani Mudaliar and others are not claiming that the Tamil past was Shramana or that the Buddhists were a significant presence, or even sort of setting great store by Dravidian difference. So what you find them doing is, whatever this antiquity is, let's take a critical agnostic lens to it. And I think this is interesting that you have Buddhism being sort of brought in to a kind of an adjacency with this critical agnostic lens. Again, not very surprising, because you also find that there were a number of Buddhists who were very invested in science at that time. And here you see a very important person, Lakshmi Narasu, who was a member of the Madras Secular Society, but later on associated with the Buddhist Mahabodhi Society. And his book, The Essence of Buddhism, is something Dr. Ambedkar would recommend highly during the time that he contemplated conversion to Buddhism. So Lakshmi Narasu was drawn to Buddhism, both on account of its sort of what he termed its scientific understanding of reality and its metaphysics, which did not run contrary to the experiments of natural science, as he put it. So there's that whole, coupling of Buddhism and science. And this is a kind of a side story which emerges in the late 19th century, but it remains a side story for the most part. It's of course picked up later by the self-respect movement, by Periyar and others. But I think as far as rethinking the Tamil past as Buddhist, in a very significant way, you need to look to another very important figure from this period of time who was contemporary to Lakshmi Narasu and to the Madras secularists, and that is Pandit Ayotidas. And Pandit Ayotidas' understanding of history was singular, fascinating. The man did many things with his life, and I won't have time to go into all of them now. But basically, he was a man of, was at large in the public sphere. He ran a magazine called Tamilan, you see that on your left. He petitioned British government on various issues to do with rights and justice and access for Dalits to schools, to positions in the colonial administration. And he also took issue with nationalism, saying that what kind of a nation is it that will still insist on separating the Dalit neighborhood from the caste neighborhood? And how can you imagine a nation as a spatial unity when you have this fundamental and constitutive line of division running through every village? So he would raise these questions about nationalism. But I think for our purpose, what's very interesting is his understanding of history, of which thankfully we know a great deal now, and a great deal is being written about the way he thought of history itself, of time past itself. And a lot of this work is being done by this brilliant young scholar, Stalin Rajangam, who's a professor of Tamil. And these are 3 of his books. I've just given you rough translations of the titles. But basically, reading Ayodhya Tasir and sort of reviewing Stalin's own understanding of what Ayodhya Tasir says about history, this is a kind of a brief summary, which is that Ayodhya Tasir does not think of history as a series of interlinked causal events alone. He sees the past as a palimpsest, and he says that this is something that has been subjected to centuries of layering, so that you don't have a sense of how civilization and culture once existed here. And in his understanding, that civilization and culture were Buddhist, but over a period of time, the Buddhist core of this civilization has been layered over by what he calls Brahmanical notions of history and time and change, Brahmanical interpretations of the soul and God and fate and so on. So much so that you misrecognize what you once were. And this is where I think we need to think of the word recklessness, because he's making a huge claim that we've misrecognized ourselves for centuries, if not a millennia or 2. And this misrecognition is something that he wishes to interrogate. And how might one interrogate this misrecognition? Is by viewing what you have in the present through the lens of Buddhism. And then whatever has been layered over will sort of open up to you, and you can actually see the rational and humane core of social relations, of production, of history, which has since been layered over. And he attempts such an unlayering himself in his various essays. And of course, I won't have time to go into it, but I think what's important is to understand his idea of all history as misrecognition, and to work against the grain of such misrecognition. And why is that important? Not only because we won't be ourselves otherwise, but also because the consequences of that misrecognition have been profound. It has led to the installation of an extremely violent and unequal social order. It has led to the permanent segregation of a section of society. And it has led to the subordination of women's intellect, amongst other things. So on all these 3 counts, we need to fight misrecognition. So Ayodhya Tasir is interesting because he combines both, and this brings me back to what Dilip was saying about Satadru, that this very important philosophical pragmatism, that you need to do this in view of what you can hope to gain from the past, but also in terms of how you would understand that past. And such a reading is there in Aloysius's, G. Aloysius, who put together Ayodhya Tasir's writings in the 1990s. And his work on the Tamil Buddhist movement kind of explains this sort of very interesting balance between a philosophical pragmatism and a deep engagement with Buddhist metaphysics and with Buddhist ethics, which you find in Ayodhya Tasir. And then you link this with his public activities, and you have a very profound coming together of the antiquarian, the ideologue, and the citizen, And I think it is this that has stayed with us today. But before I come to the present, let me take you on a very entertaining detour. This is the moment of what scholars and historians have called the Dravidian engagement with the past. And some of this links back to whatever was understood as the word Dravidian, the writings of the missionaries, the writings of the scholar adventurers, and so on. But it acquired certain very specific quality when you have the publication of literature that some date back to the early years of the first millennium, to the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era. And that happens in the late 19th century with men like C.V. Damodaram Pillai beginning to publish texts that until then had only been available as palm leaf manuscripts. And much of this is today known as Sangam literature. In fact, the texts that constitute Sangam literature were canonized in the context of publishing them, right? So even as they were being published, they were canonized. And interestingly, 2 texts became very important parts of this canon, one of which was a Buddhist epic, Mani Mehalai, and the other was a sister epic called Silapadigara. And Damodaram Pillai had actually published the first Buddhist manuscript, so to speak, Veerasoryam, but it was left to Saminath Iyer, who published many, many, many palm leaf manuscripts in his lifetime, to publish the text of the Manimehalai. And it's an interesting moment because while he viewed his task in light of his larger publishing endeavor, that he was doing this for the greater glory of Tamil culture and the Tamil language, he was perplexed by how to place this Buddhist text. And he said nothing prepared him to for what he discovered while reading it. He had published a Jain text before, but that hadn't posed as much of a problem because he could consult with a group of Jain families who had a very active history of transmitting the content of these texts. But as far as Buddhism was concerned, there was no such community, right? So how might he make sense of it? And then he tells us he did so by speaking to some scholars who are acquainted with what we today call the late colonial discovery of Buddhism and the writings that range from, say, Edwin Arnold's Light of Asia to a number of other texts. So apparently his friend Rangachari read these texts, summarized their content for him, and helped him understand the metaphysical content of Manimehalai. But I think what's important for us to take note of here is that Saminath Iyer realizes that here is his Buddhist text with such rich meaning, which could not have existed if there hadn't been a Buddhist community in the past. But then there's no sign of that community later on in time. So he claims this text is authored by a Buddhist, but he claims it for the greater glory of Tamil culture, because he can't quite square it with a Buddhist Tamil community, because in his understanding, there is none. Now, of course, Ayodhitas was arguing the opposite, that there was Tamil Buddhism and there are Tamil Buddhists to this day, only we don't recognize ourselves as such. And of course, Swaminath Iyer and Ayodhitas never met, though they were both part of the same city. They perhaps even crossed each other's paths in one manner or the other, but there was no conversation that ensued. So this is interesting because the Dravidian recovery of Manimehalai and Buddhism is made part of a larger argument about the Dravidian difference and how, therefore, Tamil society has to be seen not as a variation of what you find in the Gangetic plains, but as a civilization and society in its own right. So Buddhism is sort of accommodated to sort of refine that argument. It is not seen as a very central aspect of being Tamil, which is how Ayodhitas interprets it. And then all the leaders of the Dravidian movement, of course, reference Buddhism, like you find P.T. Tyagaraja doing. He was one of the founders of the South Indian Liberal Federation of the Justice Party. So you find him drawing on Buddhism to make an argument against Brahmanical hegemony in the present. And you have Periyar talking about Buddhism in 1957. Actually, Periyar talks about Buddhism pretty much through his political career. He sees the Buddha as a rationalist, as someone who wasn't interested in God, and who issued a challenge to Brahmanical, scriptural, and social authority. And in 1956, when Ambedkar converted to Buddhism, Periyar supported his measure and that move. But I think what was important for Periyar about Buddhism was that Buddhism credits each and every one of us with the ethical and intellectual discretion to separate right and wrong. And each of us has the buddhi to do so. And that was important for him because he felt that alone would make for self-respect and for equality. So Buddha was also seen as opposed to Brahmanism. But importantly for Periyar, the fact that the Buddha and Buddhism were active constituents of civilization in Tamil Nadu and elsewhere meant that the views espoused by people like him, and indeed by people who were part of the self-respect movement, has a historical precedent. In fact, in many of his speeches, Periyar would say that in so many words, that not since the time of the Buddha have people said this consistently. So like the Buddha, we choose to stand the world on its head. And so that's quite interesting. Now, the Dravidian movement, unlike, say, the work undertaken by missionaries or by scholar adventurers or by men like U.V. Saminath Iyer, sort of was a broad spread movement. So it had newspapers, it sort of propagandized against the power of the Brahmins and the caste system. Public meetings were held, people toured the length and breadth of the Madras presidency. So it was a popular movement. And popular movements rely on different means of communication. Ayotidas himself ran lectures in public and so on. And the Dravidian movement, which emerged in the era of mass nationalism, had recourse to a wider ambit of public communicative means. And so it's not surprising, there were two films that were made on Manimehalai, one in 1940 and one in 1959. The 59 film is interesting because it brings together all that I've been speaking so far. You have the Buddha there. You have the three symbols of Tamil history, the three flags, the Cheras, Cholas, and Pandyas. And you have this Amuda Surabhi, the never-ending bowl that Manimehalai has, which is always filled with food, which she then feeds the world with. And so it's a very interesting bringing together of the ethical, the historical, the mythic, and the rational. So this is a film that came out in 1959. Now, apart from this, there is this public realm, and then you have the realm of the scholar, and then you have the historical realm of the missionary. You also have the realm of cultural critics, those that wrote on literature and culture. And it's not surprising that they sort of took to valorizing the Buddha as well. And this man is particularly interesting, Mailachini Venkatasamy, because he set in motion a way of looking at Tamil history, not simply through the textual lens, but equally through walking through the landscape of Tamil Nadu, identifying monuments, sculptures, paintings, listening to folk songs, speaking with people about their beliefs and customs. And he wrote this book called Buddhism and Tamil, and also several other books on the Buddha. And basically his scholarship opens up a way for us to think about how might you relate the famed temples of the Tamil landscape to the kinds of arts that were patronized and encouraged and supported by the broader Shramana traditions, both Buddhists and Jains. And in this context, he spoke and wrote a great deal about the so-called dark ages of Tamil history, which is from, say, the 3rd or 4th century, the Common Era, till the 8th century. That's when the Pallava dynasty takes over. And traditionally, historians would consider those to be the dark ages. But he says that's a Brahmanical delusion, because that was the time when the Shramana traditions took root in this country. Be that as it may, it's a historical argument that we might accept partially, not accept, and so on. But it's something that has pushed subsequent generations of scholars like Paramasivam to ask questions such as this one. Why should I consider myself a Hindu? Because my tradition has aspects of the Shramana past. And even if I'm a Hindu, I experience that in a very different way from what is usually associated with the word Hindu. So this is something that continues to happen in the broader Tamil cultural realm. This may not be a popular realm, but it's certainly a public realm, and you find that happening. And so you have a very radical left poet who has his own take on the Manimehalai, sort of entering this debate in his attempts to sort of challenge, the claims being made about Tamil history and culture, challenging the hegemony of the Brahmins. And you have another writer, a civil liberties activist, A. Marx, who's also written about the Manimehalai. And it seems to me that these men in public life were known for very sharp and very distinctive political views, draw on the Tamil association with Buddhism while making their arguments. And of course, there's a contingent context for this as well. Inqilab does that in his attempts to challenge the Hindu right. R. Marx does that in his attempts to sort of pluralize the idea of Tamil identity. Because there was this sort of a turn to Tamil nationalist atavism during the heyday of the conflict in Sri Lanka. You had a kind of let me put it unkindly, a voyeuristic Tamil nationalism, which was at large in Tamil Nadu. And many of us were troubled by it because it refused to address what, again, Satadru calls attention to. How do we treat others? It's not how others treat us. And I think people like Marx wanted to ask that question about Never mind that the Tamils are victimized in Sri Lanka. That's serious. Yes, you need to address that. But look at us. How do we practice difference and hierarchy in Tamil Nadu? And then he draws upon the Manimehalite to make his arguments. Now, apart from all of this, you have the Ambedkarites who converted along with Ambedkar to Buddhism in the 1950s, stalwarts like M. Sundarajanath, Erimalai Ratnam. So they've kept a very sort of a consistent memory of Buddhism present in the public eye. And they have their own cycle of rituals and rites of passage, meetings, and so on, a very thriving subculture which is clustered around the Ambedkarite understanding of the Buddha and Buddhism. And one very important continuation of that exists in this city-based group, Chennai group called the Nila Dhamma group, largely comprising women, and they meet every Veshat or every full moon night in an Ambedkar memorial, and they do lots of things together. There's a lot of singing, there's some chanting, they read Ambedkar's writings, they read from the Buddhist texts, and they have public lectures. And so interestingly, during lockdown, they had a talk on Alexander Cunningham, the archaeologist, because he's seen as very important in the so-called recovery of Buddhism that happened in the early 19th century. So you have a very thriving Buddhist subculture, and I suspect that this has been the case since the 1950s. But I think all of this have sort of, for us today, even as I was putting this talk together, I could sort of plot these various different engagements with Buddhism across different moments in time. I could plot all of this together because we have this very rich debate and discourse about the so-called Buddhist part of the Tamils, which has been set in motion by the publication of Ayotthidasa's work, but equally importantly by the ways in which these are being drawn upon by a generation of young scholars. I spoke of Stalin Rajangam. Now, along with him, there are many others, and they have started this institution called the Tamil Buddhist Research School, which does some very interesting things. They publish books, they hold talks, they try and get into conversation with like-minded people in other parts of India. For instance, they had people from Kerala come and talk about the Buddhist presence in Kerala. They've been trying to connect with people in Karnataka and so on. So I think it is them, it is this group that has kept, whose activities are around us, even as I speak, and who have helped people like me sort of try and think of public history in a new sense, rather just in terms of Aryan versus Dravidian. That was a major trope which sort of anchored an understanding of public history, Aryan versus Dravidian. And that's something that I've tried to trace in this talk rather briefly. And of course, there's a cultural component to that, which has sort of sustained ourselves as being different, and which I think has had some very productive and consequential results in the sense that we are happy to own up to what I call Tamil secularity and not be polarized along lines of religion, which is something you find in other parts of the country. But then the flip side of that has been that this secularity also is a driven secularity, because there is caste. There is this line of division that exists between caste Hindus and Dalits. So Dalits, wanting to make sense of this driven nature of Tamil secularity, have made this sort of movement towards speaking of the Tamil past in a language drawn from Ayotthidas. So they're trying to tell us, let's take a Buddhist lens and let's see what happens. And I think this manner of doing history, it's both reckless because there are bound to be many, many gaps in this understanding, but it's something that we desire to do. They desire to do, and some of us are very interested in understanding the nature of that desire and standing along with it as students of history ourselves or as teachers of history, and see what kind of conversations are possible and how might we understand this. It's not going to be a very easy task all the time. And while some of it speaks to us directly, the Buddha as a figure of compassion, mercy as someone who was for equality, but some of it, such as say, am I going to then say that every religious structure here is Buddhist? Historically, how might I make sense of that? And we also know what happens when you claim a certain structure as only this and nothing else. We've run into a number of extremely problematic and tragic quarrels on that account. So there are questions left to be explored. But on the other hand, this manner of doing public history is something that's undertaken in order to reconstruct the world along lines of equality, respect, mutuality, fraternity, and justice. And I think, therefore, it's something that public historians might want to be in conversation with various others that are invested in these values. So my attempt today has been to present a slice of an interesting public historical debate from this part of India, so that we may pluralize our understanding of our various and intersectional past. Thank you very much. I wonder if I think Dilip has lost connection because there's an electricity failure. So
Okay.
I'm going to
Okay,
conclude
Geetha.
this on behalf of the group. So let me just do that, and then we'll see how to do this.